A lot of you by now will have heard of Pathways, the British propaganda game, but what you probably haven't heard yet is that the entity behind that game has already infiltrated the US education system. When it comes to the recent coverage of the Pathways situation and the way the story has travelled online, it says as much about the internet as it does about the game itself. Over the past few weeks, the meme-worthy story of British authoritarianism has passed from person to person, usually framed as a supposedly brand new British government propaganda game aimed at school children, awkward in execution, heavy in tone, and instantly recognisable thanks to its already iconic character, Amelia. For many people, the joke's at Pathways' expense were not an opportunity to laugh something away, but to latch onto a symbol that seemed to crystallise a much broader frustration, a system attempting to manage behaviour and opinion so clumsily that it ends up revealing far more about its own assumptions than it ever intended to. Amelia has not become popular because people find her ridiculous. She has become popular because people recognised what she represents. She functions less as a joke and more as an accidental mascot for standing up against institutional overreach, a calm, smiling interface, fronting a framework that treats ordinary political instincts as something to be monitored, nudged, redirected or corrected. But as with most viral moments, what's being shared most enthusiastically is not the full picture. I've noticed that certain claims have been repeated from clip to clip and comment to comment that simply aren't true, while far more significant parts of the story have been ignored altogether. The game is nothing new, the political responsibility is being misaligned, and the organisation behind it is already operating well beyond Britain's borders. So, while for most their attention has been fixed on Amelia as a symbol, a much larger and far more consequential story has been unfolding almost entirely outside of the frame. So today we are moving beyond the memes to look at the true picture. I am Lady Decade, and if you like your gaming news spicy, then hit that subscribe button, because it's time to talk about the British propaganda game and the entity behind its pivot into American schools. If you're looking for something to do with your time to avoid the compulsion of sending out an illegal tweet, then don't worry, I have you covered. Right now you can grab 36% off Quarantine Zone The Last Check, 29% off A Star Rupture, and a hefty 47% off Escape the Backrooms, which means you can pick it up for under $5. And that's just the start. You can use my links below to get discounts of up to 90% on thousands of modern releases, including plenty of the big hitters from the last few years. And if you enjoy what I do here and want to support the ongoing humanitarian effort known as keeping free speech alive in the UK, you can also back the show over on Patreon. You'll get behind the scenes cosplay content, extra bits and bobs, and yes, my brand new shoot as the extremely patriotic Amelia, bravely standing out for diverse thoughts in an increasingly more authoritarian country. Thank you, Patriots, and now back to the video. One of the most persistent claims being repeated online regarding the emergence of Pathways is that it is a recent creation, something that's been rushed out under the current Labour government as part of a brand new push around extremism or political education. And look, before anyone starts frothing, let me be clear, I very much dislike Keir Starmer just as much as the rest of you. But even I'm not going to blame the man for a game that was already finished, funded and sitting on a shelf long before he'd even found the keys to number 10. Pathways was developed back in 2023. Funded through the Home Office's Prevent programme and deployed into schools long before two-tier Keir became Prime Minister in July 2024. I'm not telling you this out of a matter of interpretation or political preference, it's a matter of basic chronology. This abomination of a game already existed pretty much largely unnoticed for more than 2 years before it ever became a viral talking point, which is precisely why so much of the commentary surrounding it feels confident while being so fundamentally wrong. Which raises another obvious question as to why it suddenly exploded in January of 2026. The answer doesn't come down to a government policy change, new funding or a fresh rollout, but to something far simpler: exposure. a national newspaper, The Telegraph, dragged a project that had been sitting in the background into the light, and once that happened, the usual internet mechanics kicked in. Clips circulated, gaming creators picked it up, Amelia became an icon, and the game was rapidly reframed as evidence of a uniquely British authoritarian impulse supposedly spearheaded by Keir Starmer's government. Everything about Pathways feels intrusive and deeply uncomfortable, which is precisely why the story began to move faster than the facts surrounding its creation ever could. Outrage is efficient, corrections are not. And once a narrative like that takes hold, it becomes very easy to point it in the wrong direction with complete confidence. But discomfort alone doesn't tell you who actually built this, when it was built, or why it exists at all, and that's where the popular version of the story starts to fall apart. The funding for this game, of course, still came from the Home Office, but it was during the final stretch of the last Conservative government, operating under a prevent framework that predates Labour's return to power by several years. So, sure, we can quite reasonably criticise Labour for allowing the project to remain in place once they took office, but blaming Starmer for its existence is simply wrong. And that mistake is serious because once outrage is anchored to the wrong political target, it becomes much easier for the real architects of the project to slip out of view. And personally, I don't think we can move past this topic without naming and shaming the real culprits behind this mess, and why they're so eager to stay out of the spotlight ever since. By now you've probably heard that Shoutout UK developed Pathways in partnership with Hull City Council and East Riding of Yorkshire Council, and those basic facts are not in dispute. What has been almost entirely glossed over, however, is that this project had very little to do with either the Conservative Party or Labour at all. The detail that keeps being missed is political control at the local level. Hull City Council has been under Liberal Democrats' control since 2022, taking 29 of the 57 available seats, a position it retained the following 2024 local elections when gaining 2 more seats, totalling 31 of the 57. That means Pathways was neither a Labour-run council initiative nor a product of Labour's local political culture. At the level where this project was actually implemented and designed, then approved and delivered, Liberal Democrat governance was the dominant influence. That distinction should have been acknowledged because the Liberal Democrats occupy a very particular and often misunderstood space in British politics. Nationally, they are not a mass party in the way that Labour or the Conservatives are. Their vote share is spread very thinly across the country, rarely translating into outright national power, and they are often perceived as politically harmless, technocratic, or simply irrelevant. They're quite literally made up of losers. Yet locally, especially in councils and regional authorities, they can be surprisingly influential. They present themselves as pragmatic, sensible and community-focused, positioning their politics as evidence-based and morally serious rather than ideological, which allows them to exert real institutional influence without attracting the same level of scrutiny as the 2 larger parties. Their supporters tend to see them as the grown-ups in the room, socially liberal, pro-institution, pro-expert, and committed to what they describe as moderation and democratic values. Their detractors, however, tell a very different story. Critics argue that the Liberal Democrats often function as a managerial class party, deeply comfortable with bureaucratic power, NGOs and quangos, while lacking a strong democratic mandate. They are frequently accused of using the language of neutrality and reasonableness to advance a narrow ideological worldview, particularly on issues of identity, migration and civic behaviour, all while avoiding the electoral accountability that comes with national governance, such as with the bigger parties. Seen through that lens, the Liberal Democrats' role in Pathways begins to make far more sense. This was not a project driven by populist politics or partisan campaigning, but one shaped within a local governance culture that prioritises institutional stability, behavioural management and expert-led intervention. Once you understand who the Liberal Democrats are supposed to be and how they actually operate in practice, it becomes much clearer why a project like Pathways emerged where it did, and why blaming the usual red versus blue suspects misses the real story entirely. At the level where this project was actually conceived, signed off and delivered, Liberal Democrat governance shaped the institutional environment in which it emerged, which is why continuing to frame Pathways as another Labour scandal misses the substance of what's really going on. Following on from everything I've just covered with you today so far, that naturally leads us to Matteo Bergamini, the founder and CEO of Shoutout UK and the most consequential individual in this entire story. You see, Bergamini is not your regular businessman. He was already embedded in political and institutional networks long before Shoutout UK ever became a recognisable name. His links to the Liberal Democrats are neither incidental nor speculative. Earlier in his career, he served as a youth officer, worked within liberal youth structures, and interned for senior Lib Dem figures, placing him firmly inside the political culture well before Shoutout UK had established itself as an organisation. Founded within the mid-2010s, Shoutout UK has grown into a well-connected institutional actor in the fields of political literacy, media literacy and counter-extremism education, working closely with government departments, councils and other public bodies. In 2023, the same year Pathways was created, Matteo Bergamini was awarded an MBE for services to charity, social enterprise and education. An MBE, or Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, is not a casual accolade. It is awarded through a formal nomination process reviewed by civil service committees and ultimately approved by the government before being conferred by the monarch themselves, typically recognising individuals whose work aligns closely with public policy priorities and institutional objectives. Far from signalling outsider status, receiving an MBE places someone firmly within the recognised and endorsed structures of Britain's contemporary establishment, marking them out as a trusted participant in its civic and political ecosystem. Which is why it's important to be clear about what kind of establishment figure he actually is. Culturally, however, Bergamini does not fit the image of a traditional British establishment figure that some critics instinctively picture. Instead, he comes from an immigrant family with Italian heritage, part of the post-war European migration story that has long since become an ordinary feature of modern Britain. That detail is important not as an accusation but as a value judgment. But because it complicates the idea that Pathways reflects some inherited insular British worldview being imposed from above, the person most responsible for the project is not a holdover from an older elite, but a second-generation Italian-British social entrepreneur whose assumptions are shaped by international networks, NGO culture, and transnational policy spaces as much as by any traditional notion of British political identity. Once you recognise that, it becomes much harder to treat Pathways as a purely domestic curiosity, because one of the most striking omissions in the viral discussion around the game is the extent to which Shoutout UK already operates inside the United States. So while the British debaters remained fixated on assigning blame at home, the organisation behind the project has been expanding its presence across the Atlantic, laying the foundations for this framework to travel well beyond the political context in which it first attracted attention. Despite presenting itself as rigorously neutral, if you visit the Shoutout UK website, they repeatedly insist that it operates under what it calls a policy of aggressive impartiality. On its own terms, this means the organisation claims not to be biased towards any political party, ideology or worldview, and that it actively enforces this neutrality across its projects, its staff and its educational material. Employees are prohibited from expressing political views, endorsing parties, running for office, or even wearing political symbols, all in service of the idea that political literacy can be taught without ideological influence. The difficulty is that this claim doesn't survive contact with the organisation's own worldview. In a 2020 piece advocating for political literacy, Matteo Bergamini laid out what he viewed as the primary dangers created by its absence, pointing to misinformation, declining critical thinking, weakening trust in institutions and, most revealingly, the rise of populism. That list is presented as common sense, but the decision to place populism alongside misinformation smuggles an ideological judgment in as if it were a neutral fact. This framing is not neutral because populism is not an objective pathology in the way misinformation or factual error might be. Whether populism is seen as a democratic corrective or as a destabilising force depends entirely on one's political assumptions. To many centre-right and populist voters, populism represents accountability, responsiveness and a rejection of insulated elites who have grown distant from the electorate. It is often the mechanism through which ignored concerns are finally forced back into political conversation. To establishment institutions, however, such as the one run by Bergamini, populism is framed very differently. It is treated as volatility, emotionalism, and an unpredictable threat to managed consensus. In that worldview, declining trust in institutions is not a warning sign that perhaps those institutions may need some form of reform, but a problem to be corrected in the public itself. Once populism is categorised as a danger rather than a signal, political education shifts away from encouraging debate and towards moderating attitudes. This is where Bergamini effectively drops the mask. His treatment of populism exposes the assumption underpinning projects like Pathways. Political literacy, as defined here, is not about equipping people to interrogate power or understand democratic systems, but about preserving trust in existing institutions and discouraging political expression that challenges them too directly. By placing populism alongside misinformation as something to be managed, neutrality gives way to a clear institutional bias in favour of stability over disruption, consensus over contestation, and governance over genuine democratic friction. So in practice, Bergamini's objection isn't to misinformation, but to political resistance that threatens elite insulation. The tension in this situation is not abstract, it is embedded directly into how Pathways functions. Within the game scenarios, expressions of concern about immigration, patriotic sentiment, skepticism towards mass migration, or attendance at protests about cultural change are repeatedly treated as early warning signs on a so-called radicalisation pathway. These are not fringe beliefs, they are mainstream political positions held by millions of voters, yet within the logic of the game they are flagged as potential precursors to extremism requiring intervention. Violence is not the trigger, criminality is not the trigger, political discomfort is. The language of impartiality collapses completely. What Pathways presents as neutrality is in practice the enforcement of a particular institutional worldview that defines its own assumptions as common sense and treats deviation from them as a safeguarding concern. This worldview is reinforced by the ecosystem Shoutout UK operates within, partnering with organisations such as the United States Department of State, NATO-linked initiatives, Meta-affiliated digital working groups, NewsGuard and United Nations-linked verification campaigns. These are not ideologically plural places. They represent a broadly shared establishment consensus about risk, stability and acceptable political behaviour. Taken together, this reveals what aggressive impartiality actually means in practice. It does not mean the absence of ideology, it means defining a specific ideological framework as neutral and then aggressively enforcing that definition, particularly on young people who have no meaningful ability to contest it. Once this is understood, Pathways stops looking like an accidental misfire and starts looking like a coherent expression of institutional orthodoxy branded as objectivity and delivered through education. Which brings us to the part of the story that has been almost entirely ignored: Shoutout UK's incursion into the United States of America. A brief look at Shoutout UK's own materials is enough to confirm that its ambitions are no longer confined to Britain. The organisation has established formal operations in Wisconsin, with a base in Milwaukee where it runs a media literacy programme called ClickSmart. This initiative is aimed squarely at educators and young people and is already being introduced into American schools, framed not as controversial, ideological or political, but in exactly the same language used back home, as a sensible, preventative response to misinformation, polarisation and declining trust. It is presented as civic housekeeping rather than political intervention, a neutral tool designed to smooth out democratic friction before it hardens into something more disruptive. What's striking is not simply that this program exists, but how quietly it's been embedded. There's been no significant public debate, no sustained media scrutiny, and very little awareness that a British organisation operating under the Prevent-era logic is now participating in American civic education as well. Beyond its work in Wisconsin, Shoutout UK is already collaborating with US institutions, including the United States Department of State, positioning itself inside American civic and educational structures in a way that mirrors its trajectory in the UK almost exactly. In other words, the ideas underpinning pathways are not confined to Britain, and they are not being treated as experimental or fringe once exported abroad. They are being reframed under different branding, normalised as best practice, and absorbed into a much broader international framework concerned with managing political behaviour rather than simply understanding it. While British debaters remained fixated on optics, attribution, and the personality of Amelia, the model who has already begun to travel just as it did in the UK for several years before anyone paid attention. Past this point, this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because it reframes pathways not as a uniquely British embarrassment, but as part of a wider effort to define political literacy, acceptable engagement, and civic behaviour across Western democracies. The fixation on Amelia has distracted from a more uncomfortable reality, which is that this approach is neither static nor local, and it is not staying neatly contained within national borders. That trajectory also makes far more sense once you return to the individual driving it. Let me remind you, culturally, Bergamini does not fit the image of a traditional British establishment figure that some critics are putting across. The person most responsible for pathways is not a holdover from an older, insular elite, but a second-generation Italian-British social entrepreneur whose assumptions are shaped by international networks, NGO culture, and transnational policy spaces, not the traditional notion of British political identity. Seen through that lens, the expansion into the United States is not an anomaly or a side project, it is the logical next step. Pathways was never designed to be a one-off British experiment, but a portable framework capable of being rebranded, recontextualised and redeployed wherever institutions feel the same anxieties about political unpredictability and loss of control. The only real difference between the UK and the US is that the British noticed the problem internally first. Whatever your view of the international spread of this kind of institutional thinking, understanding why it is happening now requires looking back at Britain itself. The political conditions that produce pathways did not emerge in a vacuum. The old two-party settlement that dominated British politics for decades is visibly fracturing, and the familiar red versus blue framing no longer reflects how people actually vote, think or organise their priorities. At the centre of that disruption is Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, a party built almost entirely around a voter dissatisfaction with managed consensus politics. Reform has drawn support from across traditional party lines, particularly from voters who feel ignored on issues like immigration, national sovereignty, cultural cohesion and democratic accountability. What makes Reform uniquely unsettling to the political establishment is not just its polling numbers, but the nature of its support. These voters are not loyal in the old sense, they're not attached to party brands, and they're not responsive to the messaging techniques that sustained Labour and Conservative dominance for generations. Farage himself is a key part of this dynamic. Love him or loathe him, he has demonstrated repeatedly that he can mobilise large sections of the electorate outside traditional party structures, first through UKIP, then through Brexit, and now through Reform. He represents a style of politics that bypasses institutional gatekeepers, speaks directly to voter grievance, and treats elite discomfort as proof of effectiveness rather than something to be avoided. For institutions built on predictability and gradual consensus, that is profoundly destabilising. As of the time of uploading this video, Reform is widely viewed as a serious contender in the next general election, not necessarily because it mirrors the old path to power, but because it breaks it. In a fragmented political landscape where voter allegiance is fluid and turnout patterns are volatile, a movement that consolidates disaffected voters rather than trying to triangulate them can outperform expectations very quickly. Reform does not need to win over the entire country to change it, it only needs to make the existing system unworkable. And it is this loss of manageability that matters the most here. The rise of Reform UK has forced every established party and the institutions aligned with them to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. Large numbers of voters are no longer deferential, no longer trusting, and no longer willing to be guided gently back into the consensus. Once politics becomes unpredictable in that way, the instinct of institutions is not to loosen their grip, but to look for ways to intervene earlier, upstream, and outside the electoral arena altogether. This is where organisations like Shoutout UK become useful. They offer tools, frameworks and language designed to smooth political volatility before it manifests at the ballot box. This is also why the Liberal Democrats matter far more to pathways than anyone has bothered to give credit for. The Liberal Democrats are no longer content to exist as a peripheral protests party on the margins of national power. Instead, they have focused on consolidating influence at the level of local government, charities, NGOs and civic institutions, spaces where political framing can be shaped both quietly and persistently without the risks that come with governing nationally. Hull City Council is a clear example of that strategy in practice. From that vantage point, projects like Pathways stop looking accidental and start looking purposeful. Not as crude propaganda, but as attempts to define the boundaries of acceptable political behaviour at a time when traditional loyalties are dissolving. The game is a product of prevent-era safeguarding logic, Liberal Democrats' local governance, and a social enterprise culture that operates comfortably across borders rather than within them. The rise of Reform has only accelerated this dynamic because political volatility is deeply unsettling to institutions built on consensus, predictability, and managed outcomes. So, while it may be tempting to dismiss Pathways as a curiosity or to file it away as another example of British bureaucratic clumsiness, doing so misses the point entirely. The game itself is awkward and heavy-handed, but the system that's produced it is neither accidental nor uniquely British. It reflects a deeper shift in how political risk is being assessed, how dissent is being categorised, and how educational tools are increasingly being used to preempt public sentiment rather than respond to it. Don't forget that right now you can grab 36% off Quarantine Zone The Last Check, 29% off Star Rupture, and a hefty 47% off Escape the Backrooms, which means you can pick it up for under $5 dues. And that's just the start. You can use my links below to get discounts of up to 90% off of thousands of modern releases, including plenty of the big hitters from the last few years. And if you enjoy what I do here and want to support the ongoing humanitarian effort known as keeping free speech alive in the UK, you can also back the show over on Patreon. You'll get behind the scenes cosplay content, extra bits and bobs, and yes, my brand new shoot as the extremely patriotic Amelia, bravely standing up for diverse thought in an increasingly more authoritarian world. Thank you, Patriots, and I'll see you all again soon.